Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
With the summer vacation season not too far off, no doubt many National Park Service superintendents are trying to figure out how to manage the crowds and avoid impacts to natural resources in the park system. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. With Memorial Day weekend just 2 weeks away, and Congress in its usual battles over how to fund the federal government, we wanted to take a look at how the funding situation looks for the Park Service. To help understand the financial setting across the national park system, we've asked Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks to provide some insights. We'll be back in a minute with Phil.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at vrpfoundation.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome back to the Traveler, Phil. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you, Kurt. Great to see you. Great to be back. It's an interesting time now, and
it is. It seems that whenever we get together, we're talking doom and gloom for the Park Service budget. And when last we visited this topic, I think it was late fall, and there was the threat of another government shutdown because House couldn't come to terms with the Senate on a budget number for the federal government. They managed to pass through a continuing resolution, but I believe that continuing resolution and budget agreement was pretty hard on the National Park Service, wasn't it?
yeah, I have in front of me a report that was dated November of 2023, which is interesting. It was written by the Congressional Research Service. And I've been trying to get actual numbers from the National Park Service, and it's hard to do.
Yeah.
But in looking at this list, it says that in fiscal year 23, that the budget for the Park Service was about $3.5 billion, $3.475 billion, and that they requested $3.76 billion. And the House passed a budget of $3 billion. And then the Senate passed a budget of $3.457 billion. And at the end of the day, I mean, they're looking at another reduction in the Park Service budget, which is, and I don't think everyone really realizes, and I've come to realize that people really don't understand, and it's understandable why. What that means to an agency. You know, what happens when you cut someone's budget? You know, I was in the Park Service for 40 years and was a manager for most of those years in one way or another. And I remember times where we looked at our budget about halfway through the year and we found out we didn't have enough money to finish the year, because of budget reductions or flat budgets, or because of increases that weren't funded by the Congress. The pay increases for employees, you know, there's been some nice pay increases for employees, which was overdue, you know, but the money didn't accompany the increase. And so a large percentage of the Park Service budget goes to employees' salaries and support costs and fixed costs. And so the superintendents have to not fill jobs or keep vacancies open for longer and not have as many people to serve the public or protect park resources. Has a amazing impact on morale downward, and it makes it more difficult now to recruit and retain employees, and it's difficult. The Park Service has done some good things though, with one-time funding like the Great America's Outdoor Act, the Legacy Restoration Fund Act, and there's been a variety of funding, but not funding that is ongoing, that goes from fiscal year to fiscal year to give the managers the ability to hire and retain employees and to do things that at one point in time the National Park Service was able to do.
Yeah. And you're talking billions of dollars, 3.4 billion. And of course, the Park Service budget is broken out into various aspects. I mean, there's the operations budget, which pays for the day-to-day operations in the park system, as well as there's a maintenance and construction budget lines and various other budget lines. I believe back in March, NPCA, National Parks Conservation Association, said that the budget agreement was going to cost the Park Service $150 million to the current budget. And as you mentioned, that the budget bill does not provide any additional funds to help the parks cover that 5.2% pay raise that Congress ordered last year. When you start looking at more granular, again, the $150 million cut represents overall 4.3% budget cut from FY23 funding and a 1.2% or $35 million cut in the Park Service's operations budget. Now, some people might think, well, those are single percentage. It's not that big of a deal. It's not that much money. But you look around the park system, and there's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done. There are a lot of positions that have been left unfilled because park managers don't know how to fill them because they don't have the money to fill them. It just goes on and on and on. The impacts, and somehow the park going public needs to appreciate these budget cuts when they go to their favorite park. Perhaps it's the Blue Ridge Parkway, which last year shut one of its campgrounds earlier than usual because they didn't have the staff.
Yeah, and some places aren't open anymore at all. But those are some of the impacts. Let's take the Blue Ridge Parkway, for example. There's over 600 buildings to maintain. There's 14 visitor centers to maintain, a measly 500 miles of road or so, overlooks and restrooms and 200 miles of trail, working with 4,300 neighbors. So there's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of accidents and incidents and a lot of infrastructure to maintain and roads to repave and trails to maintain. And so if you've got an employee, I was telling someone yesterday who I spoke to, who's a staffer in Congress, and I just mentioned that the Park Service has lost thousands of positions, literally thousands. I can't get an exact number. It's at least 2,500. And I read one publication who indicated it's more like 5,500 vacancies. And so the thing that happens when you've got the drop in numbers of people and then trying to add people back is that there are costs associated with everybody that works there. Somebody needs supplies and materials to accomplish their job. It could be toilet paper for restrooms. It could be water lines for campgrounds or visitor centers or other public use areas. It might be new shingles for a roof or new air conditioning systems. The things that we all experience, in day-to-day life as we manage our own homes. I've had to replace my HVAC system a couple of times since I moved in here. That's not cheap. And then our cars wear out and we have to replace them in trucks. And there's all these other costs that are often never talked about that has to be done. in order to keep a park in decent shape. I'm not talking about, creating expensive, luxurious places. I'm talking about basic maintenance, fixing holes in roads and sidewalks and trails. And, we have a high windstorm. And I remember once in the Smokies, we had 11,000 trees come down in one storm. 11,000. And so somebody had to clear that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that costs money. It creates unsafe conditions if we can't take care of those problems. I tell a true story that happened years ago in the Parkway. We had a homicide, and the rangers were called, of course, to respond to this homicide up in the northern part of the Parkway, and they hop in their patrol car, and it wouldn't run. It was so old and needed maintenance, they had to hop into the back of a pickup truck and ride to the site of the homicide of a young student. And, that's really unfortunate. I know in the Smokies, they handle over 3,000 incidents a year. They have as many as a dozen fatalities in a year. It's still a real safe place to go because, 12 fatalities out of 15 million visitors your chances of being okay is pretty high. But it still takes time, unless, if you're a member of the family who's lost someone, is that one fatality means everything.
Sure.
And so I think there's a lot of things that people never get to know. They don't know, and there's no way for them to know. People love the parks. They would love for the parks to be well funded, I'm convinced. But the politics in Washington and the mechanisms for allocating funds makes it very difficult, I think, for us advocates out there trying to raise more money for the National Park Service to be successful.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that you're talking about are just normal wear and tear, and don't include the disasters that strike, such as the flooding that hit Yellowstone a couple years ago, and that hit Death Valley, and that hit Mojave National Preserve, and the wildfires. And I believe at the end of the year, Congress came up with over $100 million just to address a handful of parks that were struggling with disasters. And now with climate change impacts seeming to be around every corner, I noticed the other day a number of national parks, including Mammoth Cave National Park, closed down because of the weather forecast that was calling for tornadoes. I mean, how many tornadoes does Mammoth Cave National Park ever see? And then you've got sea level rise in Fort Pulaski in Georgia and the problems that it has with keeping the waters back. And you can go on and on and on. The expense of operating these fabulous places just keeps going up and up and up, not to mention the increasing numbers of visitors that go out there.
Well, and also increasing numbers of parks. There are many special places that we need to preserve. There's stories that have left untold that I think is important to the country. And times change, and we need to protect many of these sites, and there's great interest in them. And every year, people advocate for a new park unit to be included in the national park system. And when a new unit is added, there's costs associated with that. And I'm glad that we're trying to protect these special places, because unless they're protected, the stories will be lost.
You mentioned there were some places in parks that are closed to the public because of lack of staffing. I'm just wondering, back, I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, the superintendent at Yosemite National Park threatened to close the gates, and he actually might have closed the gates just because he didn't have the resources to manage the crowds. Have you heard from any of your peers still in the service? Is anybody talking about closing this area of the park or closing that area of the park? I mean,
yes, I have, but not widespread. It's harder to talk with people because of COVID People aren't answering the phones. They aren't responding to requests. I think there's some political aspect of this. I remember sending in a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Park Service seeking information so I could understand the problems and challenges in the National Park Service. I didn't get a response for 3 years. I called the first park where I worked way back in the 70s and multiple times and left a message. I never heard from them. I've called regional offices and no one answers the phone or no one calls back. I was in Washington just the other day and I went to headquarters of the National Park Service, and it's like a ghost town there. There's hardly anyone present, very few people that I know. I don't think there are very many people left in the National Park Service and headquarters who have any park experience. Uh, so, the impacts of COVID and reduced funds and political changes is having a big effect, adverse effect, I think, on our agency. I heard just yesterday someone suggest that the National Park Service should be its own agency. I mean, and not be part of the Department of the Interior anymore.
Yeah.
Because of the politics associated with being part of the Department of the Interior. Is that a good idea? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. It's been debated for many years, but yeah, I remember being in Yosemite in 1989 through 1991, and I remember important people from the Washington office would come down, and Appropriations Committee staffers would show up, and we would tell stories about the number of rangers that were once in Yosemite Valley, which I think the number was 28, and at the time of this visit, we only had 5 left. So I don't know what the answers are. We keep plugging away, providing information, and I know we sound critical, and I think that we all just love the parks, and we're disappointed, when things get worse, when we don't have the resources and manpower and equipment to get the job done like we once were able to.
Yeah. Phil, it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe this is a poor analogy. I think it fits, is like, how do you boil a frog? You put a frog in a pot of cold water and you slowly increase the temperature. And what we're seeing here with the Park Service is we're slowly reducing the amount of money it has to operate while increasing the responsibilities and the needs for that money. One of the impacts of climate change are the shoulder seasons in the parks are getting longer. And you well know how valuable seasonal employees are to the park system and the parameters that are put on those seasonal workers. How is that impacting the parks?
Well, I think it's having a big impact. I know that lack of housing, affordable housing, is having an impact. Thankfully, some members of Congress are trying to assist, and there have been some donations made by private sector organizations that has allowed for replacement or improvement of existing housing. But if you go to Yosemite, you mentioned Yosemite. I used to be in charge of housing. It was one of my responsibilities, and we had, for National Park Service employees, nearly 400 houses. And the concession operator had probably 2,000 places that house the concession employees. And so the money that's been granted, to help protect these houses that we have, or maybe build new ones and replace them, it's great. It's very much appreciated, but it's not enough. I mean, more needs to be done. So I know if an employee is looking for a job, and there's some really key, important, and fun jobs, places that people want to go. Yosemite is one, but maybe the best example that I can think of is in Grand Tetons.
Hmm.
And if you go to Jackson, Wyoming, it's a place where I've heard someone say it's a place where billionaires are buying out all the millionaires, right?
Kicking them out.
And so the housing there is very expensive, and the salaries our employees are earning, it just doesn't allow for them to live there in Jackson very well. I mean, there are probably some examples. So we've been looking at some new hiring authorities that might allow employees to take the jobs that the Park Services has that are vacant, and we can't get them to fill it under the current situation. And one of the hiring authorities we've been seeking is local hires. And so hiring people from the communities themselves who maybe don't need housing. But that's going to require the Office of Personnel Management to approve it, and OMB to approve it. And there's a lot of steps that have to be gone through in order for that kind of response to this problem to occur. I don't know about you, but I know where I live, the price of a house is more than doubled in the last 5 or 10 years. And so where do employees going to go? And then when we have a house to fill, we've been putting 1 or 2 or 3 people in a room. You know, there aren't enough bathrooms. When during COVID, people were passing COVID around one to another, and new policies were created saying that you can't have more than 1 person per room. And so housing is a huge issue and a very expensive problem. But one is really important to the morale and the ability to attract and retain employees that are needed to maintain the parks and serve the visitors.
And, you mentioned that we're seeing some relief come in, but it seems that, it's the haves and the have-nots. I mean, Yellowstone has made great progress. I know Friends of Acadia has helped Acadia National Park find some housing for employees. Mammoth Cave just recently embarked on new employees housing. But, there's 429 units in the national park system, and interest rates are high to buy a house if you want to do that. And GS5 salaries are low. I don't know how it works. I don't know how you make it work.
Yeah, it's going to be it's a hard issue to address effectively. I've continued to go to my university on recruiting trips for the National Park Service, and the last couple of times I've been, we have a room full of people who come. Probably 30 people will show up. And we have several sessions of 30 people, kids, young people. We talk about jobs, state park. People were there, and city parks, and people were there, and so forth. And so, and of course, I'm there promoting the National Park Service. And the last couple of times, when I've asked people, which of you, who is really interested in becoming a National Park Ranger? And I got the same answer both times. And the answer was 0, not any. And so I wanted to explore that some more. I said, well, what is it that you want to do? And more people want to work for city parks than national parks. But most of the people who are in these colleges within the university, they want to be involved in recreation of some kind, sports. Coaches, they want to be a coach, and not really interested in working in a national park. I bring up, if you are talking because you're an athlete, is that why you want to be involved? And I say yes, and I said, well, saving somebody's life on the side of El Capitan requires some athleticism. And backcountry skiing, in order to save someone's life or find someone, requires quite a bit of stamina and athleticism as well. And it says, don't discount the National Park Service if you want a job that requires, being an athlete, being physically fit, because there's plenty of those jobs available. But without success,
You got to try harder, Phil.
I know, but I keep going back. I'm 72 years old. I've been doing this since I was about 25.
There are some great jobs out there. I mean, river rangers. I mean, spend your week floating the river and camping out every night and making sure that the visitors are safe and not in any trouble. I've been reading this book, The Wolverine Way, that came out a couple decades ago, I think, about wolverine research in Glacier National Park. And the things that these some of them were volunteers with the research program, some were full-time employees, but getting up in the middle of the night when the wolverine trap alarm goes off and you've got to ski out there to the trap and sedate the wolverine and do whatever you need to do, put in a transmitter or whatnot and let it go. I mean, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and having to ski 10 miles to this trap or whatnot takes some talent, takes some physical attributes, and at the same time, you backcountry skiing, it opens it up for you there. So there is lots of parallels to recreation in a city park or a county park in the national park system. But I have to believe, Phil, that the biggest problem is what we've touched on, is the salaries and the housing situation. If you can't solve those conundrums, I don't think you'll be able to, fill all the jobs that you need to fill.
Well, and I think the hiring process itself is very cumbersome. People go to USA Jobs and fill out applications, and then the applications are sent to our Washington office, and a lot of people don't want to go through that process. They're not sure how to use it. And if you go online, or maybe it's just because I'm a former Park Service person, I see a lot of questions and answers online because there aren't personnel people available in parks anymore. People have questions. Well, how do you do this? What kind of application should I have? How much detail should I provide? What happens? Can I apply for more than one park? There's a ton of questions, and there's no one there to answer the questions anymore. And there used to be personnel staff located, especially in bigger parks. And smaller parks used to get assistance from the bigger parks, and there were people in the regional offices around the country that could provide assistance. People have questions about retirement and benefits, and they're just not accessible anymore. And the Park Service continues, to my utter amazement and disappointment, to centralize those systems. And instead of things getting better, it's getting worse. And the reason, why are they doing that? Well, they're trying to be more efficient. They're trying to save money. Well, I think at some point in time, when you're trying to be efficient, if you go too far, instead of that being a good thing, it becomes a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid, and I don't know, I'm not there every day, and, I'm an old guy, and they probably look at me and say, well, you're just not with it anymore. But I think I'm not alone in feeling this way. A lot of my old guys and gals, friends who work for the National Park Service feel, I think, very similarly as I do, that things are just not working as well as they could.
Yeah. Well, listen, enough of the doom and gloom. It's springtime. It's springtime in much of the country, although here at Traveler headquarters in Utah, it's still snowing. The good news with that is we need the moisture and I don't have to cut the grass. But getting excited about traveling out into the parks. My wife and I are supposed to go up to Grand Teton in June for some paddling on Jackson Lake, which is full. Thank goodness. What are you seeing on your end of the country? You got to be getting excited about hitting Great Smokies or going up to the Parkway.
Yeah, I worked in the Smokies for 11 years and the Blue Ridge Parkway for 8 years, and we're slammed with people. It's great, but it's still possible, just like you talk about in Yosemite or some other parts. You know, you would say, well, look at all the people, 15 million people, 16 million people come to this park, 4 million people in Yosemite and now Yellowstone. But you can go to these parks and there's plenty of places that you can still go.
Yeah.
And enjoy such incredible beauty and have such a fantastic experience. You know, that I really hate to dwell on the doom and the gloom, because over 300 million people are still coming to the national parks.
All right, now hold on. The Smokies, I've been there several times, and one of the last times I went there, I was told to go visit Cataloochee because people don't know about Cataloochee. Is that still the case, or has it been discovered?
Oh, it's been discovered, of course, but it's not as busy as other places in the Smokies. You know, the last numbers that I saw, which has been a while, you know, there's like 2 million people that visit the Smokies in the Gatlinburg area, 2 million people in Cades Cove, 2 million people up on top of the mountains, and a little less over in Cherokee. So it can be busy, but there's 900 miles of trails too.
Yeah.
And if you go on one of the more popular trails, you're going to find a crowd. Now, when I was at the Smokies, we had a long survey going that began way back in 1952. We surveyed the public to find out what they thought about their experience. In Case Cove, it can take you several hours to drive around that 11-mile loop road.
Yeah.
But 82% of the people that we interviewed think that's just fine. They're okay with the crowds.
And if you're not okay with the crowds and you don't know what Cataloochee is, it's the smaller version of Cades Cove. And when I was there, I had it to myself. And granted, this was in the late 90s, so it's been a while.
Well, when we reintroduced elk back in, let's see, what year was that? Somewhere around the year 2000, I believe it was, 2000, 2001. And a lot of people are now driving there to see the elk. We have volunteers who help manage that. They call the Bugle Corps.
Right.
And it's a beautiful place. And the Blue Ridge Parkway, you know, 16 million people, the most visited unit of the National Park System, is right next door. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, but look at all the commuters.
Yeah.
Those numbers have been excluded. The 16 million doesn't include them. but once you're on the Blue Ridge Parkway, it's easy to find places which aren't crowded and extraordinary views and the biodiversity.
Such as. Nobody's listening.
Pardon?
We can share these secrets.
Well, there's a lot of favorite drives, you know, that you can take and really not find huge crowds, and days of the week and time of the day. You know, you have to consider all those things. But in the Smoky, in this region, we've got national forests surrounding the parks, you know, and they're all as busy as the national park units. But a beautiful, incredible, hundreds of thousands of acres of resources. Now I'm sounding like a travel tourism promoter, but it's really a special, amazing place.
And all the surrounding communities. Talk about local color.
Yeah, you know, the Parkway was all about drive a while, stop a while. And I remember when we had the 75th anniversary of the Parkway, I was superintendent at that time, and we created a board. And we had someone from every county, all 29 counties, were on the board to plan for the 75th anniversary, with the idea of talking about driving a while and stopping a while and sharing what was in the local communities, the things there are to see and do. But then on the Parkway, we're always trying to take care of the scenic views, the view sheds.
Right.
And so, but there's just some amazing spots here. And Yosemite can be terribly crowded in the valley, as you know. But hop on the roads and get out of the valley, head to Wawona, or, you know, head up
Tioga Road.
Tioga Road, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. get on a trail, see the falls. That is just amazing.
Yeah. One thing I'm going to be watching this year, how are gas prices affecting travel? How is the RV industry is down, sales are down. People who bought RVs during the height of the COVID pandemic are rethinking that strategy. I noticed for the first time and maybe forever that some of the concessionaires were saying, hey, it's March and there's still plenty of availability in our summer lodges. I wonder if we're going to see a decline in visitation this year because of the cost of travel.
Maybe so. I always thought that gas prices was one of the most important indicators of what kind of season that we were going to have. But now I think it's more complex than that. I think the other costs are also having impacts. Taking some of the disposable income, housing costs, and is one, and inflationary costs in the grocery store, which I think has declined, but people still, I think, feel that the prices are higher than they were.
Yeah.
Even those items that aren't more expensive. So, but yeah, I think the economy is sort of complex, and I'm not sure exactly what the key indicators are. But certainly gas is one of them. Cost of motel rooms probably has an impact too.
Park lodging, $300, $400, $500 a night.
Exactly.
So let me ask you, you've been up on the Hill talking to Congress folks. Are there any park issues aside from the budget that are being talked about that we should watch for?
Well, I think global climate change is certainly one of the most important. And, I think about cities too, like down in Miami, who I think Miami has begun to, in New York, I just read an article the other day about building higher walls around New York because of rising sea levels. In Miami, I know had talked about that. It's going to impact the Everglades for sure, and other parks, coastal parks around the country. Air quality continues to be a problem. We need to solve the air quality problem. It's impacting human health as well as the health of our natural resources, as well as our historic resources, our cultural resources. And so, yeah, those things have to be addressed. We can't continue the way we always have. And we can't just set it aside thinking that, people aren't telling the truth. I'm convinced that the scientists are doing a really good job of getting their numbers right.
You mentioned cultural resources, and of course, National Park Conservation Association recently launched their call for a cultural resource challenge to get Congress to invest $250 million, I believe, over a 5-year period to help the Park Service take care of its cultural resources.
And we're doing the same. The Coalition to Protect America's National Park is also joining in that effort with the same numbers. We think that's very important. Cultural resources are often forgotten. And now we're adding new parks which have cultural stories and cultural buildings and that are going to need to be preserved and protected, and the stories told, all the stories. And that's one of the things that I really come to appreciate is we got to tell the rest of the story. And I think that was Paul Harvey used to say that, right?
Yeah.
Now for the rest of the story, I think there's a lot of rest of the story that needs to be told.
There really are, and there's a lot of cultural resources across the park system landscape that are at risk from climate change, whether it's from flooding or just more precipitation, and what that's doing on some of these
century-old deposition,
century-old missions in the Southwest, or several century-olds. You go to Pecos National Historical Park and you look at that old Spanish mission, what remains of it. A lot of threats out there, and decisions to be made in what do we protect, what can we protect, and how do we protect them.
Exactly right. And who is going to do the work to do that? And And it all ties back into our earlier conversation with budget and staff and housing. It's all integrated.
But whatever happened, didn't Sally Jewell, when she was Interior Secretary, call for a revival of sorts of the Civilian Conservation Corps to engage young adults and maybe even mid-age adults to go out across the public lands landscape and tackle some of these projects that need to be tackled?
Yeah, I think that's right. If I remember right, I remember meeting her when she came to the Smokies many years ago, and conversation about that. And thankfully, there are a lot of youth organizations that exist. But here's a reminder. I'll tell you a story to make my point. Way back in about 96, in the Smokies, we decided that we needed to increase the number of volunteers. So we sent out a news article, and we got so many phone calls that it shut down our phone system. and we went from having maybe a couple of dozen of volunteers to 2,000 volunteers.
Wow.
And so same thing with Student Conservation Association or other organizations very much like that. You find in Yosemite and so forth. But you've got to have someone to manage that. You've got to have some equipment for the people to use. All of these things have to be funded and supervised and organized and orientation provided to the students and participants. And there's almost nothing is free. It always costs money. And I was saying yesterday to someone, I said, making these decisions about our budget, it's like deciding, which child do you love the most? They're all needed and they're all important. You care for them all, but you can't fund them all. And so how do you address that? Not easy.
No, it's not. And I think one thing that gets in the way is a lack of public awareness, because the Park Service doesn't promote itself as it should be. It doesn't promote itself as a career for people, and maybe it can't. I don't know what the restrictions are. I know they can't advertise for some strange reason, but building up to the centennial back in 2016, there was a lot of public awareness, corporate awareness, and I worry that some of that has fallen off. That we got to the centennial and things are good, and let's turn our direction someplace else. But as we've been talking for the past 40 minutes, there are a lot of needs out there across the park system, both in terms of budget needs and muscle needs, and it never ends. But I think public awareness can really help combat that. Many of those things.
And that's why we're doing this today, I think, is to help with public awareness. And a lot of social media efforts have been made over the years and reaching out. And it's not just, it's while it's good as important, but nothing is as important as actually being in the place itself.
Yeah.
Having that experience. I wish there was a way that we could bring more people to the parks and to experience what the opportunities are, right? I mean, I'm talking about visitors, but maybe programs once the visitors are there that have young kids. We have programs for kids, of course, and I think many of our employees actually come from those programs. But maybe the Park Service could do more of that.
Well, I think it goes back to that public awareness. I know I grew up a middle-class family in New Jersey. I never knew about the Park Service. I never knew about the Student Conservation Association. A lot of these programs that are out there today that can introduce youth to the parks, they're so very valuable, but they have to reach all segments of youth. And that perhaps is the challenge. But you introduce people to the parks, and the possibilities just expand in terms of what you want to do with your life, what impact you want to have.
Yeah, and I think organizations like NPCA and our coalition, we're trying to address that too. We're trying to reach a broader audience and be inclusive when thinking about careers and when we think about stories that need to be told, and places that need to be protected, those are important. I hope the National Park Service is successful. I don't know what structure needs to be in place to make that more possible. I know that with ever declining staffs and budgets, it's going to be very hard.
Yeah. Definitely need more historians to both investigate these stories and tell these stories.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Well, Phil, I appreciate your time today, and enough of this doom and gloom.
Well, there's no way to tell the story that we have without it sounding a bit desperate. But once you're in there, once you're visiting, once you're an employee, it's a pretty darn good experience, and I don't want that to be forgotten for sure.
Yeah, there are definitely worse places to be. And from time to time, we get complaints about our podcast being too political. And politics are part of the parks, and if you can't clear that funding hurdle, the experience is just going to go downhill. And it's been an ongoing uphill struggle. And I look forward to the day when the Park Service has more money than it knows what to do with.
Me too.
All right, Phil. That's Phil Francis from the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. Check out their website and look into the Cultural Resource Challenge and lean on your congressional delegation to encourage them to get behind it. Thanks again, Phil.
Thanks, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. While we don't like drilling down into politics and the national parks, the two are inseparable, and it's important to understand how 535 politicians in Washington, D.C. can help or hurt the national parks. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.